When a desperate mail-order bride arrives in 1867 Nevada territory to marry a wealthy stranger, she discovers her new husband is blind and harboring secrets that could destroy them both. As Celeste Morrison learns to see the world through Nathaniel Ashford's darkness, she uncovers a light more powerful than sight itself. But will their growing love survive when his past returns to claim him? The stagecoach bounced so hard that Celeste's teeth rattled like dice in a cup. Outside the dusty window, the wild mountains of Nevada looked ready to swallow her whole. She clutched the letter that would change her life forever. A marriage contract with a man she'd never met. Carson Valley, next stop, the driver shouted over the thunder of horse hooves. Celeste's heart jumped. After 3 days of bumpy roads and sleepless nights, she was almost there. Almost married to a complete stranger. Back in Boston, everything had gone wrong. Her father died, leaving behind mountains of debt. Her little sister got sick with a terrible cough that wouldn't go away. The doctor bills kept coming, and their mother cried every night when she thought nobody was listening. That's when Celeste saw the newspaper ad. Good man seeks wife. Money no problem. Right to Nathaniel Ashford, Nevada territory. She touched the small gold pin on her dress, the only thing left from her grandmother. Help me be brave, she whispered to the empty air. The stagecoach hit another bump, sending her bag flying across the seat. Inside that bag was her wedding dress, carefully folded between sheets of brown paper. She'd sewn it herself by candlelight, using fabric that cost their last $5. White wasn't her favorite color, but brides were supposed to wear white. That's what proper ladies did. Through the window, she could see a town growing bigger as they got closer. Wooden buildings lined a dusty main street. Men in cowboy hats walked next to ladies carrying colorful umbrellas. It looked nothing like the brick buildings and busy streets of Boston. This place felt wild and free, like anything could happen. You getting married? Asked the woman sitting across from her. She was old with kind eyes and hands that looked like they'd worked hard for many years. Yes, ma'am, Celeste answered quietly. First time meeting your husband? Celeste nodded, her cheeks turning red. It sounded so strange when someone else said it out loud. The woman smiled. Don't look so scared, child. Love can grow anywhere, even in the strangest places. Sometimes the best surprises come wrapped in packages we never expected. Before Celeste could ask what that meant, the stagecoach began to slow down. Her stomach felt full of butterflies doing wild dances. Through the window, she could see a man in a fancy black suit standing next to a shiny carriage. He was tall and had dark hair, but something seemed different about the way he stood. He wasn't looking around like he was searching for someone. Instead, he stood perfectly still, like he was listening for something only he could hear. That's your husband, I'd bet, the old woman said with a knowing look. The stagecoach stopped with a final jolt. Celeste heard the driver jumping down and walking around to open the door. Her hands shook as she smoothed her traveling dress and checked that her hair was still pinned up nicely. Miss Morrison? The driver poked his head into the coach. Your ride is here. Taking a deep breath, Celeste stepped down onto the wooden platform. The mountain air was crisp and clean, so different from the smoky air of Boston. She could smell pine trees and something else, maybe wildflowers growing somewhere nearby. The man in the black suit turned toward the sound of her footsteps, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. That's when she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. His eyes looked cloudy, like morning fog over a lake. He was blind. Miss Morrison, he said in a voice that sounded educated and careful. I'm Nathaniel Ashford. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Nobody had told her about this. Not in the letters, not in the marriage contract, not anywhere. She was supposed to marry a blind man, and she was finding out right now, standing on a dusty platform with her whole life packed into one small bag. I understand this might come as a surprise, Nathaniel continued, and she could hear something sad in his voice. My lawyer was supposed to mention it in his last letter. I assume he didn't. Celeste finally found her voice. No, sir, he didn't. A long moment passed between them. She could hear horses stamping their feet and people talking somewhere down the street. A dog barked in the distance. The whole world kept moving while she tried to figure out what to do next. She thought about her sick sister back home. She thought about the bills that needed paying and the promise she'd made to help her family. She thought about the long, expensive trip that had brought her here, and how she had nowhere else to go. "I see," she said quietly, then felt foolish for using that word. But Nathaniel smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Don't worry about saying see, Miss Morrison. I still use the word myself. Some things don't change just because your eyes stop working." He offered her his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His grip was steady and strong, and he walked toward the carriage like he knew exactly where he was going. "My driver will get your bags," he said as they walked. "I hope you'll find our home comfortable. It's been too quiet for too long." As they reached the carriage, Celeste looked back at the stagecoach. The old woman was watching from the window and gave her an encouraging wave. Maybe she was right about surprises coming in unexpected packages. But as Nathaniel helped her into the carriage with gentle, practiced movements, one big question filled her mind. What other secrets was she about to discover about the man she'd promised to marry? The carriage wheels crunched over gravel as they turned through tall iron gates that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Celeste pressed her face to the window and gasped. Nathaniel's house wasn't just big, it was enormous. 3 stories of white stone rose up like a castle, with windows that sparkled in the afternoon sun and columns that made her think of pictures she'd seen of ancient Greek temples. "It's beautiful," she whispered without thinking. "Thank you," Nathaniel said from across the carriage. "My father built it 20 years ago when he struck silver in the mountains. He wanted something that would last forever." His voice got quieter. "I sometimes wonder if he succeeded." The carriage stopped in front of wide stone steps that led to the biggest front door Celeste had ever seen. A man in a butler's uniform came down the steps to meet them. He was older, with gray hair and a kind face that reminded her of her grandfather. "Welcome home, sir," the butler said to Nathaniel. Then he turned to Celeste with a respectful bow. "Miss Morrison, I'm Henderson. I've been with the family for 15 years. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Celeste managed to say, still staring at the house. Back in Boston, their entire boarding house could have fit inside just the front part of this place. Nathaniel stepped down from the carriage without any help, moving carefully but confidently. "Henderson, please have cook prepare tea for Miss Morrison. I'm sure she's tired from her journey." "Of course, sir. Should I have it served in the morning room?" "Yes, that would be perfect." As they walked up the steps, Celeste noticed how Nathaniel's hand trailed along the stone railing. He'd done this same walk so many times that his feet knew exactly where to go, but his fingers still checked to make sure he was safe. It made her think about how many things she did without even thinking about them, things that must be much harder when you couldn't see. The inside of the house took her breath away all over again. The entrance hall had a ceiling so high that she had to tilt her head back to see the top. A chandelier hung down like a waterfall made of crystal, and paintings in golden frames covered the walls. The floor was made of marble that was so shiny she could see her reflection in it. "This way," Nathaniel said, walking toward a doorway on the right. His footsteps echoed in the big space, but he moved like he knew exactly where everything was. The morning room was smaller and felt more comfortable. Soft chairs were arranged around a fireplace, and tall windows looked out over gardens that seemed to go on forever. Fresh flowers sat in a blue vase on a small table, filling the air with a sweet smell that reminded Celeste of her mother's garden back home. "Please, sit wherever you'd like," Nathaniel said, settling into a chair near the window. "I hope you don't mind if we talk a bit before dinner. I know this situation is unusual." Celeste chose a chair across from him, smoothing her skirt nervously. Now that they were alone, she didn't know what to say. How do you talk to someone you're supposed to marry when you've only known them for 30 minutes? "I should explain about my eyes," Nathaniel began, saving her from having to figure out how to start. "I wasn't born blind. It happened 5 years ago in an accident." "What kind of accident?" The question popped out before she could stop it. Then she felt embarrassed. "I'm sorry, That's probably too personal. Not at all. It's a reasonable question. He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how much to tell her. I was thrown from a horse, hit my head on a rock. The doctors said I was lucky to survive, but my sight was gone. Celeste tried to imagine what that would be like, waking up one day and finding out you'd never see another sunset or read another book or watch another person's face. It seemed too terrible to think about. Were you married then? She asked carefully. Something changed in Nathaniel's expression. His jaw got tight, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair. I was engaged to be married. The accident happened on what was supposed to be our wedding day. Oh, Celeste felt like she'd stepped on something sharp. I'm so sorry. She decided she couldn't marry a blind man. He continued in a voice that sounded flat and empty. I suppose I can't blame her. It wasn't what she signed up for. Celeste stared at him. How could someone do that? How could you promise to love someone and then leave them when they needed you most? It made her angry in a way that surprised her. That's awful, she said, and meant it. Nathaniel looked surprised. Is it? I've always thought it was practical. Marriage should be based on what people can give each other, not romantic ideas about love conquering everything. Before Celeste could answer, Henderson appeared with a tea tray. The china cups were so delicate she was afraid she might break one just by looking at it too hard. Henderson poured for both of them, then quietly left the room. Is that why you placed the advertisement? Celeste asked after taking a sip of tea that tasted better than anything she'd ever had. Because you wanted something practical? Partly. Nathaniel found his teacup without fumbling, like he'd memorized exactly where Henderson always put it. I also thought it would be fairer to find someone who knew what they were getting into from the beginning. Except I didn't know, Celeste pointed out. He had the grace to look embarrassed. No, you didn't. I apologize for that. If you want to leave, I'll understand. I'll pay for your return trip to Boston and give you enough money to help your family. Celeste set down her teacup with a small clink. The offer was tempting. She could go home, help pay for her sister's medicine, and forget this whole strange day ever happened. But then what? The bills would keep coming, and eventually the money would run out. At least here, she could help her family and maybe figure out how to build some kind of life for herself. What would you expect from me? She asked. If I stayed, I mean, companionship at social events, help managing the household, someone to read my correspondence and help with business matters. He paused. I should be clear, this would be a marriage in name only. You would have your own rooms and complete privacy. That last part should have made her feel relieved, but instead it made her feel a little sad. Not because she'd expected romance, she barely knew this man, but because it sounded so lonely. For both of them. And in return, financial security. For you and your family. Your sister's medical expenses would be taken care of, and your mother would never have to worry about money again. It was exactly what she'd hoped for when she answered his advertisement. So why did it feel like something was missing? I have one question, she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Of course. Why did you really want to get married? You have plenty of money, a beautiful home, people to help you with business. You could hire someone to read your mail and manage your social calendar. Why did you need a wife? For the first time since she'd met him, Nathaniel looked uncertain. He was quiet for so long that she wondered if he was going to answer at all. Finally, he said, because I'm tired of being alone. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't the practical answer she'd expected. It was something much more human and real. All right, she heard herself saying. I'll stay. Are you certain? Yes. And surprisingly, she was. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but maybe it could be something good anyway. When do we get married? Tomorrow morning, if that's acceptable to you. The minister will come here at 10 o'clock. Tomorrow. In less than 24 hours, she would be Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford, married to a man she'd met this afternoon. It should have terrified her, but instead she felt something like excitement mixed with curiosity. As the sun began to set outside the tall windows, painting the room in shades of gold and orange, Celeste wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would this practical arrangement turn into something more? Or would they spend the rest of their lives as polite strangers sharing the same house? Only time would tell, but for the first time since leaving Boston, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd made the right choice. The wedding dress felt like it was trying to strangle her. Celeste stood in front of the mirror in her new bedroom, tugging at the collar that had seemed perfect when she'd sewn it back in Boston. Now it felt too tight, too fancy, too much like she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. Deep breaths, she told her reflection. You can do this. Through the window, she could hear voices downstairs. The minister had arrived early, and Henderson was probably offering him coffee in the front parlor. In 30 minutes, she would walk downstairs and marry a man she'd known for exactly one day. Her hands shook as she tried to pin her grandmother's brooch to her dress. A soft knock on the door made her jump. Come in, she called, expecting to see one of the maids. Instead, a woman she'd never seen before stepped into the room. She was beautiful in the way that made other women feel plain golden hair piled high, a dress that probably cost more than Celeste's family made in a year, and the kind of confidence that came from never doubting you belonged wherever you happened to be. You must be the bride, the woman said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm Victoria Caldwell. Nathaniel and I are old friends. Something cold settled in Celeste's stomach. The way Victoria said old friends made it clear they'd been much more than that. How do you do? Celeste managed, trying to sound polite instead of suspicious. Victoria glided into the room like she owned it, running her fingers along the furniture and looking around with the familiarity of someone who'd been here many times before. I heard about the wedding from Henderson. Such short notice. I simply had to come see for myself. That was kind of you. Celeste wasn't sure what else to say. This woman was clearly someone important in Nathaniel's life, but he hadn't mentioned her at all. I suppose he told you about his previous engagement? Victoria asked, settling into the chair by the window like she planned to stay a while. A little. Celeste's fingers found the brooch again, needing something to do with her hands. I imagine he made me sound quite heartless. Victoria's laugh sounded like wind chimes, pretty but somehow cold. Men always tell the story from their point of view, don't they? Celeste didn't answer, but Victoria continued anyway. The truth is, I was 23 and terrified. When the accident happened, I didn't know how to handle it. I'd never been around anyone who was different. She paused, studying her gloved hands. I made a mistake leaving him. I've regretted it every day since. Then why didn't you come back sooner? The question slipped out before Celeste could stop it. Victoria's perfect smile faltered for just a moment. Pride, I suppose. And by the time I realized what I'd lost, I thought it was too late. But then I heard he was getting married, and I knew I had to try one more time. The cold feeling in Celeste's stomach spread to her chest. Try what? To win him back, of course. Victoria stood up, smoothing her skirts. I know you probably think you care about him, dear, but you've known him for one day. I loved him for 3 years before the accident, and I've loved him for 5 years since. That's not something you can compete with. Before Celeste could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Henderson, looking flustered in a way she hadn't seen before. Miss Morrison, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the minister is asking if you're ready. And Sir is wondering. He glanced at Victoria with confusion. Miss Caldwell, I didn't realize you were here. Hello, Henderson, Victoria said warmly. I wanted to surprise Nathaniel. Is he in his study? Yes, miss, but... Victoria was already heading for the door. Perfect. I'll just go say hello before the ceremony. She swept out of the room, leaving Celeste and Henderson staring after her. Should I stop her? Henderson asked quietly. Celeste's mind raced. Part of her wanted to run downstairs and interrupt whatever Victoria was planning to say to Nathaniel. But another part of her, the part that remembered growing up poor and always feeling like she didn't quite belong anywhere, whispered that maybe Victoria was right. Maybe Nathaniel would take one look at his beautiful former fiancé and realize he was making a terrible mistake. No, she said finally. Let them talk. Henderson looked worried. Miss, If I may say so, Sir has seemed happier in the past day than he has in years. Don't let anyone make you doubt that you belong here. His words were kind, but they couldn't quiet the voice in her head that said she was fooling herself if she thought a rich, educated man like Nathaniel could really want someone like her. 15 minutes later, Celeste made her way downstairs on unsteady legs. The house was too quiet. She could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, but no voices from the study where Nathaniel and Victoria were talking. The minister waited in the front parlor, a thin man with kind eyes who smiled when he saw her. "You look lovely, my dear. Are you ready?" "I think so." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Weddings can be nerve-wracking," he said gently. "But I've known Nathaniel for several years, and I've never seen him as content as he seemed yesterday when he asked me to perform this ceremony." Before she could ask what he meant by that, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, and Celeste's breath caught. He was dressed in a dark suit that made him look even taller than usual, and his hair was combed back carefully. But it was his expression that made her heart skip. He looked troubled, like someone who just received unexpected news. Behind him came Victoria, her smile triumphant in a way that made Celeste's stomach drop. "I'm sorry for the delay," Nathaniel said to the minister. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony passed in a blur. Celeste heard herself saying the words she was supposed to say, felt Nathaniel slide a ring onto her finger, listened to the minister pronounce them husband and wife. But the whole time, she couldn't stop thinking about the look on Nathaniel's face and the satisfied expression Victoria wore as she watched from the back of the room. When the minister pronounced them married, Nathaniel leaned down to kiss her cheek, a polite, brief touch that felt more like a duty than a celebration. His lips were cold, and his hand trembled slightly when he took hers. "Congratulations," Victoria said, stepping forward with tears in her eyes that looked perfectly real. "I wish you both every happiness." She hugged Nathaniel a moment too long, and Celeste saw her whisper something in his ear that made his jaw tighten. As the small group moved to the dining room for the wedding breakfast Henderson had prepared, Celeste felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold. She was married now, Mrs. Nathaniel Ashford, but instead of feeling happy or excited or even nervous, she felt empty. During the meal, Victoria entertained them with stories about people Celeste didn't know and places she'd never been. Nathaniel was polite but quiet, answering when spoken to but not adding much to the conversation. Several times, Celeste caught him turning his head toward Victoria's voice with an expression she couldn't read. When Victoria finally announced she had to leave to catch the afternoon train, Celeste felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the woman's unsettling presence would be gone, but dread about what Nathaniel might be thinking after their private conversation. "It was so wonderful to meet you, Celeste," Victoria said with that same too bright smile. "I'm sure we'll see each other again soon." After Victoria's carriage disappeared down the drive, Nathaniel excused himself to his study, leaving Celeste alone in the big house with nothing but her thoughts and the uncomfortable feeling that her marriage was already over before it had really begun. That evening at dinner, they sat at opposite ends of a table that could have seated 20 people. The silence stretched between them like a canyon, broken only by the soft clink of silverware and Henderson's quiet footsteps as he served their meal. Finally, Celeste couldn't stand it anymore. "What did she say to you?" Nathaniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I beg your pardon? Victoria, what did she say to you before the ceremony?" He set down his fork and was quiet for so long that Celeste wondered if he was going to answer at all. "She said she'd made a mistake," he said finally. "That she wanted another chance." The words hit Celeste like a slap, even though she'd been expecting them. "And what did you tell her?" "That it was too late. That I was getting married in 10 minutes. But that's not what you wanted to say, was it?" Nathaniel's hands gripped the edge of the table. "What I wanted doesn't matter. I made a commitment to you. That's not an answer." He was quiet again, and in that silence, Celeste heard everything she needed to know. Victoria had been right. How could one day of knowing someone compete with years of love and shared history? "I see," she said quietly, though her heart was breaking. Well, at least we both know where we stand. She excused herself and went upstairs to her room, leaving her new husband alone at the enormous table. As she changed out of her wedding dress and hung it carefully in the wardrobe, she wondered if this was how the rest of her marriage would be. Two strangers sharing a house, both of them wishing they were somewhere else. But as she lay in her new bed, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, one question kept her awake. If Nathaniel still loved Victoria, why hadn't he called off the wedding when he had the chance? Rain drummed against the library windows like impatient fingers, trapping Celeste inside for the third day in a row. She sat curled in the window seat, pretending to read a book while actually watching her husband move around the room with his peculiar grace. 2 weeks had passed since their wedding, and they'd settled into a routine that felt more like living with a polite stranger than being married. "Would you like me to read to you?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. They'd barely spoken since the morning Victoria left. Nathaniel paused in his examination of the bookshelf, his fingers tracing the leather spines with practiced ease. "That's not necessary. I have my own books." He pulled out a volume covered in strange raised dots and settled into his favorite chair. Celeste had seen these books before but had never asked about them. Now curiosity got the better of her. "How does it work?" she asked, moving closer. "Reading with your fingers, I mean." For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed and held up the book so she could see the cover. "It's called Braille. Each combination of raised dots represents a different letter or word. Could you teach me?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His head tilted slightly, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he looked directly at her. "Why would you want to learn?" "Because..." She struggled to find the right words. "Because it's part of your world, and I don't understand your world at all." Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around his eyes. "It's not easy to learn. I'm not afraid of hard work." He studied her for a long moment, then patted the arm of his chair. "Come here, then." Celeste perched on the chair's wide arm, close enough to smell the soap he used and feel the warmth radiating from his body. He opened the book and guided her finger to the first line of dots. "This is the letter A," he said, pressing her fingertip against a single raised dot. "Feel how it's positioned in the cell." His hand covered hers, strong and surprisingly gentle. As he moved her finger across the page, explaining the patterns and combinations, Celeste found herself paying more attention to the way he spoke about the books than to the actual dots. There was passion in his voice, excitement about knowledge and stories and ideas. It was the first time she'd seen him truly animated since Victoria's visit. "You love this," she observed. "Reading?" He shrugged. "I suppose I do. It was the first thing that made me feel normal again after the accident." "Who taught you?" "A teacher from the school for the blind in Boston. My father hired him to come here for 6 months. Nathaniel's voice grew quieter. "It was the last thing he did for me before he died." Celeste felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm sorry. It must have been difficult, losing your father so soon after your accident." "He blamed himself," Nathaniel said simply. "The horse that threw me was a gift from him for my wedding day. A spirited stallion that was supposed to show off my riding skills to the wedding guests. That wasn't his fault. I know that now, but grief doesn't always listen to logic." They spent the next hour working through the alphabet, Nathaniel's patience surprising her. When she struggled with similar letter combinations, he didn't get frustrated. When she asked the same question twice, he answered it twice. Slowly, the dots began to make sense under her fingertips. "You're a quick learner," he said as she successfully identified her first complete word. "Most people take weeks to get this far. I had a good teacher." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. Nathaniel went very still. For a moment, the only sound was rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Then he cleared his throat and moved her hand to a new section of the page. "Let's try a longer passage," he said, but his voice sounded different, somehow warmer, less careful. As the afternoon wore on, their lesson evolved into something more like conversation. Nathaniel told her about his favorite books, both the ones he'd read before his accident and the ones he'd discovered since. Celeste shared stories about the books she'd loved growing up, the ones she'd borrowed from the lending library when her family couldn't afford to buy them. "I always wanted to read everything," she confessed. "But there was never enough time or money for books." "There are over 3,000 books in this library," Nathaniel said. "You're welcome to read any of them. Even the ones that aren't in Braille? Especially those." He hesitated, then continued more quietly. "I'd like to hear them again. Through your voice." Something warm unfurled in Celeste's chest. It was the first time since their wedding that she'd felt like he actually wanted her company, not just tolerated it. The sound of hoofbeats on the gravel drive interrupted her thoughts. Henderson appeared in the doorway a moment later, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but you have a visitor. Miss Caldwell has returned." The warmth in Celeste's chest turned to ice. Nathaniel's hand dropped away from hers, and the careful mask she'd grown accustomed to slipped back over his features. "Show her to the morning room," he said, already standing. "I'll be there shortly." After Henderson left, an awkward silence filled the library. Nathaniel closed the Braille book and set it aside, his movements suddenly jerky and uncertain. "I should go see what she wants," he said without looking at Celeste. "Of course." Celeste tried to keep her voice neutral, but she could hear the hurt creeping in anyway. Nathaniel paused at the doorway. "Perhaps we can continue the lesson later." "Perhaps," she agreed, though they both knew they wouldn't. After he left, Celeste remained in the window seat, watching the rain streak down the glass. Through the library's open door, she could hear voices from the morning room, Victoria's musical laugh and Nathaniel's deeper responses. They were too far away for her to make out words, but the tone was familiar and intimate in a way that made her feel like an intruder in her own home. She tried to return to her book, but the words swam on the page. Instead, she found herself thinking about the past hour, about the way Nathaniel's face had lit up when he talked about reading, about the gentle patience in his voice as he taught her. For a brief moment, she'd caught a glimpse of the man he might be if he weren't carrying around so much old pain. But now Victoria was back, and that glimpse was gone. The voices from the morning room grew louder, and Celeste heard Victoria's distinctive laugh ring out again. Unable to stand it anymore, she slipped out of the library and up the stairs to her room. From her bedroom window, she had a perfect view of the front drive, and she settled in to wait for Victoria to leave. But as the afternoon wore on, no carriage appeared. Victoria was staying for dinner, maybe longer. That evening, Celeste dressed carefully in her best gown, a deep blue silk that had been her mother's, and made her way to the dining room. She found Nathaniel and Victoria already seated, Victoria in the chair that had become Celeste's usual spot. "Celeste," Victoria stood with a brilliant smile. "I hope you don't mind my imposing on your hospitality." Nathaniel insisted I stay for dinner. "Of course not," Celeste replied, taking the seat Henderson pulled out for her at the far end of the table. "What brings you back so soon?" "Business, actually." Victoria settled back into her chair with the air of someone completely comfortable. "I'm thinking of buying property in the area, and I wanted Nathaniel's advice on the local market." Throughout dinner, Victoria regaled them with stories about her travels since leaving Carson Valley, her voice animated and confident. She spoke about Paris and London, about theater performances and fashionable society, about a world that seemed as distant from Celeste's experience as the moon. Nathaniel listened with obvious interest, asking questions about places he'd visited before his accident and people they'd apparently known together. Several times, Victoria referenced shared memories that excluded Celeste entirely, inside jokes and past experiences that painted a picture of deep, long-standing intimacy. "Do you remember the time we got caught in that thunderstorm at Lake Tahoe?" Victoria asked, her hand briefly touching Nathaniel's arm. "We had to take shelter in that little cabin, and you taught me to play chess by the firelight." "I remember," Nathaniel said softly, and there was something in his voice that made Celeste's stomach clench. As the evening progressed, Celeste felt herself becoming invisible. Victoria and Nathaniel talked around her, their conversation full of references she didn't understand and memories she couldn't share. When she tried to contribute, her comments fell flat, highlighting how little she knew about her husband's life before their marriage. Finally, unable to bear it anymore, she excused herself and went upstairs. But instead of going to her room, she found herself drawn back to the library, to the Braille book that still lay open on Nathaniel's chair. She picked it up, running her fingers over the raised dots they'd been studying earlier. For a brief moment that afternoon, she'd felt connected to him, like they were building something together. Now that feeling seemed foolish and naive. The sound of voices in the hallway made her look up. Through the open library door, she could see Nathaniel and Victoria at the bottom of the stairs. Victoria's hand rested on his arm, and she was speaking in low, urgent tones that Celeste couldn't quite make out. Then Victoria stood on her tiptoes and kissed Nathaniel's cheek, her lips lingering just a moment too long. "Think about what I said," she whispered, just loud enough for Celeste to hear. Nathaniel stood frozen as Victoria gathered her skirts and climbed the stairs to the guest room Henderson had prepared for her. Only after she disappeared from view did he move, his hand rising to touch the spot where she'd kissed him. Celeste sank back into the window seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. Whatever Victoria had said to him earlier, whatever she was asking him to think about, it wasn't something that included his new wife. As she sat there in the darkening library, surrounded by thousands of books full of other people's stories, Celeste couldn't help but wonder if her own story was already over before it had really begun. The rain continued to fall against the windows, washing away the last traces of the warm afternoon she'd shared with her husband, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that she was fighting a battle she'd never had a chance of winning. The breakfast dishes crashed to the floor with a sound like breaking thunder. Celeste stared at the mess of shattered china and spilled coffee, her hands shaking from more than just clumsiness. She'd been trying to serve Victoria breakfast in bed, being the perfect hostess like her mother had taught her, when Victoria's casual words had made her drop the entire tray. "I'm so sorry about the mess," Victoria said, not sounding sorry at all. "I probably shouldn't have mentioned that Nathaniel asked me to stay longer." Celeste knelt to pick up the broken pieces, her mind reeling. "He asked you to stay? Just until I can find suitable property in the area." Victoria's voice was sweet as honey, but there was something sharp underneath. "He's been so helpful with my search. We spent hours last night going through maps and property records." A piece of china cut Celeste's finger, and she watched a drop of blood fall onto the white porcelain. Hours. They'd spent hours together while she'd been lying awake in her room, wondering what Victoria had whispered to him at the bottom of the stairs. "Here, let me help you with that." Victoria slipped down from the bed, her silk nightgown flowing around her like water. She took Celeste's bleeding finger and wrapped it in a delicate handkerchief. "You should be more careful. This house has so many sharp edges." The way she said it made Celeste look up sharply. Victoria's smile was perfectly friendly, but her eyes held a warning. "I'll have Henderson clean this up," Celeste managed, backing toward the door. "Oh, don't bother him. I'll take care of it myself." Victoria was already gathering the larger pieces. "Besides, I wanted to talk to you privately." Celeste's stomach dropped, but she couldn't leave now without seeming rude. "About what?" "About Nathaniel, of course." Victoria settled back on the bed, patting the space beside her like they were old friends sharing secrets. "I know this situation must be difficult for you." "I don't know what you mean." "Come now, dear. We're both women of the world." Victoria's laugh was light and musical. "You married a man you'd never met for financial security. There's no shame in that, lots of women do it. But surely you didn't expect him to fall in love with you." The words hit like physical blows. Celeste sat heavily on the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her up. "I can see you've developed feelings for him," Victoria continued gently. "That's only natural. Nathaniel is a wonderful man, handsome, intelligent, wealthy. But you have to understand, what we had was real. We shared 3 years together before his accident, and that kind of history doesn't just disappear." "Then why did you leave him?" The question burst out before Celeste could stop it. Victoria's perfect composure cracked just slightly. I was young and scared. I made a terrible mistake. But I've grown up since then, and I've realized that true love means accepting someone completely, exactly as they are. She reached over and took Celeste's uninjured hand, her touch cool and soft. I'm not trying to be cruel, but I think you should know, Nathaniel and I have been talking about the future, about the possibility of correcting past mistakes. Celeste's world tilted sideways. What does that mean? It means he's considering having our marriage annulled. Victoria's voice was gentle, but her words were like knives. He could claim the marriage was entered into under false pretenses, which it was, since you didn't know about his condition. It would be perfectly legal, and it would free him to marry someone he actually loves. The room spun around Celeste. She pulled her hand away from Victoria's and stood up on unsteady legs. Has he said this to you? Not in so many words. Victoria's smile was sad and sympathetic. But I know him better than anyone. I can see it in the way he listens when I talk, the way he relaxes when we're alone together. He's remembering what we had, what we could have again. Celeste stumbled toward the door, needing air, needing space, needing to get away from Victoria's poisonous words and knowing smile. I really am sorry, Victoria called after her. But wouldn't it be better to face the truth now, before you get hurt even more? Celeste ran down the hallway, past Henderson who was carrying fresh linens, past the portraits of Nathaniel's family that watched her with painted eyes. She burst through the front door and into the gardens, where the morning air hit her like a slap. The rose garden was in full bloom, red and white flowers nodding in the breeze like they were gossiping about her shame. She sank onto a stone bench, Victoria's words echoing in her head. Annulment, false pretenses, someone he actually loves. Had she been fooling herself all along? Had that warm afternoon in the library meant nothing to him? Was she just a convenient arrangement until something better came along? Celeste. Nathaniel's voice made her look up through her tears. He was walking toward her along the garden path, moving carefully but confidently through the space he knew by heart. Henderson said you seemed upset. Is everything all right? She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to pull herself together. I'm fine. You don't sound fine. He settled beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. What happened? How could she tell him? How could she ask if he was planning to annul their marriage based on what his former fiancé had told her? It would sound jealous and petty and desperate. Victoria told me you're helping her look for property, she said instead. Yes. His voice was careful, guarded. She asked for my advice about the local market. And you're happy to help her? Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his words came slowly, like he was picking through a minefield. Victoria and I have a history. That doesn't just disappear overnight. It wasn't an answer, but it was confirmation enough. Celeste's heart cracked a little more. She also said. Celeste stopped, unable to finish the sentence. What did she say? That you're considering annulling our marriage. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Nathaniel went very still, his hands gripping the edge of the bench. She said that. Is it true? Another long silence. A bird sang somewhere in the roses, and Celeste could hear the distant sound of horses in the stable. Normal sounds of a normal day, while her world fell apart. I don't know, Nathaniel said finally, and his honesty was worse than any lie would have been. Celeste stood up so quickly that she swayed. I see. Celeste, wait. But she was already walking away, back toward the house where Victoria was probably still in her room, smiling at how well her morning's work had gone. Henderson met her at the front door, his kind face creased with concern. Is there anything I can do, ma'am? Could you have my things packed, please? The words came out steady, though her voice felt like it belonged to someone else. I'll be leaving on the afternoon train. Ma'am, I don't think. Please, Henderson. I need to go home. He nodded reluctantly and headed toward the stairs. Celeste walked through the house one last time, looking at the beautiful rooms that had never really been hers, the books she'd never get to read, the life she'd thought she might be able to build here. In the library, The Braille book still sat on Nathaniel's chair where they'd left it yesterday. She picked it up, running her fingers over the raised dots one more time. For a few hours, she'd felt like she was learning something important, not just about reading but about the man who'd been teaching her. But that had been before Victoria's return, before the reminder that some bonds couldn't be broken by new marriages or good intentions, or the desperate hope of a girl who should have known better than to dream of more than financial security. "You're really leaving?" Nathaniel's voice came from the doorway. She didn't turn around. "It seems like the best thing for everyone. What if I don't want you to go? Do you?" She finally faced him, memorizing the way the morning light fell across his face. "Do you really want me to stay, Nathaniel? Or are you just being polite?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. In that moment of hesitation, Celeste had her answer. "I thought so," she said quietly. "Goodbye, Nathaniel. I hope you and Victoria will be very happy together." She walked past him toward the stairs, toward her packed bags and the afternoon train that would take her back to Boston, back to her old life, back to everything she tried to leave behind. But as she climbed the stairs, she couldn't help wondering, if Nathaniel truly wanted Victoria back, why had he looked so lost when Celeste said goodbye? The train whistle screamed through the depot like a wounded animal, and Celeste jumped despite herself. She sat on the hard wooden bench with her single bag at her feet, watching other passengers hurry toward the cars that would carry them away from Carson Valley. In 20 minutes, she'd be one of them, heading east toward a life that suddenly felt more foreign than this Nevada town she was leaving behind. "Final call for the eastbound express," the conductor shouted, his voice echoing off the depot walls. Celeste picked up her bag and stood, her legs unsteady beneath her skirts. 3 days had passed since she'd left Nathaniel's house. 3 days of staying in the town's only boarding house while she waited for the next train to Boston. 3 days of avoiding the main street where she might run into him, of lying awake at night wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. "Mrs. Ashford?" A young voice made her turn around. A Mexican boy of about 12 stood behind her, his hat in his hands and his dark eyes serious. She recognized him as one of the workers from Nathaniel's estate, though she'd never learned his name. "Senora, my name is Carlos. I work in the gardens for Senor Ashford." His English was careful but clear. "He does not know I am here. I'm sorry, but I'm about to board the train. Please, Senora, you must hear what I tell you." Carlos glanced around nervously, then stepped closer. "It is about the lady with yellow hair, the one who came back." Something cold settled in Celeste's stomach. "Victoria. See, she is not what she pretends to be." Carlos's young face was tight with worry. "I hear her talking to someone when she thinks no one is listening. She has, how do you say, plans that are not good." "Plans?" Celeste corrected automatically, even as her mind raced. "What kind of plans?" But before Carlos could answer, the train whistle blew again, longer this time. The conductor was already helping the last passengers aboard. "Ma'am, you coming or not?" he called to Celeste. She looked between the train and the boy, her heart hammering. Part of her wanted to get on that train and never look back. But Carlos's worried face and his urgent words kept her feet planted on the platform. "Tell me quickly," she said to Carlos. "What did you hear?" "She writes letters. Many letters. And yesterday, I see her in the study when Senor Ashford is not there. She looks through his papers, his business things." Carlos glanced around again, making sure no one was listening. "My grandmother, she cleans the house. She says the yellow-hair lady, she asks too many questions about money, about how much the senor has." The train began to move slowly at first, then picking up speed. Celeste watched it pull away from the station, carrying her escape route with it. Now she was trapped in Carson Valley until the next eastbound train in 4 days. But maybe that was exactly where she needed to be. "Carlos, does your grandmother still work at the house?" "See, every day except Sunday. Could you ask her to pay attention to what Victoria does when she's alone? But tell her to be careful. If Victoria is up to something bad, it could be dangerous." Carlos nodded solemnly. "She will watch. But Senora, what about you? Will you go back to Senor Ashford? Celeste looked toward the mountains that surrounded the valley, thinking about the man she'd married and barely begun to know. The man who might be planning to annul their marriage, but who had also taught her to read with her fingers and looked genuinely sad when she said goodbye. I don't know, she said honestly, but I think I need to find out what Victoria is really after. The next morning, Celeste found herself doing something she never thought she'd do, spying on her husband's house from behind a cluster of pine trees at the edge of his property. She felt ridiculous crouched there in her traveling dress, trying to see through the windows without being seen herself. But her patience was rewarded when Victoria emerged from the house alone, walking purposefully toward the stables. Instead of heading for the main path, she took a smaller trail that led toward the old mining office at the back of the property. A building Nathaniel had mentioned was no longer in use. Celeste waited until Victoria disappeared into the trees, then followed at a safe distance. The trail was overgrown and hard to navigate in her city shoes, but she pressed on, driven by a growing certainty that Carlos had been right to be worried. The mining office was a small wooden building tucked away in a grove of aspen trees. Through a dirty window, Celeste could see Victoria inside, bent over a desk with papers spread in front of her. She was writing furiously, pausing occasionally to consult what looked like legal documents. Moving carefully around to the side of the building, Celeste found a window that was slightly open. She pressed herself against the rough wooden wall and listened. The property deeds are all in order, Victoria was saying, and Celeste realized she was talking to someone else. Someone Celeste couldn't see from her position. And you're certain he'll sign them? A man's voice replied. It was rough and unfamiliar, with an accent that might have been Eastern European. He'll sign anything I put in front of him if I play my cards right, Victoria said with a laugh that made Celeste's skin crawl. The poor man is so desperate to believe I've come back for love that he's not asking the right questions. What about the wife? She's gone. Packed up and left yesterday, just like I planned. A few carefully chosen words about annulment and true love, and she practically threw herself under the train wheels. Celeste's hands clenched into fists. Every word Victoria had said to her had been a lie, designed to drive her away so Victoria could have Nathaniel to herself. But not for love, for something much worse. The mining claims alone are worth a fortune, the man continued. And once he signs the papers making you his business partner, you'll have access to everything. It's almost too easy, Victoria agreed. Blind men are so trusting. He can't see what's right in front of his face. The casual cruelty in her voice made Celeste see red. Without thinking, she stepped closer to the window, trying to get a better look at Victoria's companion. Her foot caught on a fallen branch, and she went down hard, crying out as her knees struck a rock. Inside the building, the conversation stopped abruptly. What was that? The man's voice was sharp with suspicion. Probably just an animal, Victoria said, but Celeste could hear uncertainty in her tone. We should finish this later. I need to get back before Nathaniel starts wondering where I am. Celeste scrambled to her feet and limped as quickly as she could back toward the main trail. Behind her, she could hear the office door opening and footsteps on the wooden porch. She dove behind a large boulder just as Victoria emerged from the trees, looking around suspiciously. From her hiding place, Celeste watched Victoria walk back toward the house, her movements no longer graceful but sharp and predatory. When she was sure Victoria was gone, Celeste crept back to the mining office. The mysterious man had vanished, but he'd left something behind, a piece of paper that had fallen near the window. Celeste picked it up with trembling hands and read the few words she could make out. Transfer of assets, power of attorney, signature required. Her blood ran cold. Victoria wasn't just trying to win Nathaniel back. She was trying to steal everything he owned. The loving, repentant fiancé was nothing but an act, a way to get close enough to rob him blind. Literally. Celeste stuffed the paper into her reticule and hurried back toward town. She had to warn Nathaniel, but how could she do it without revealing that she'd been spying? And would he even believe her? After all, she was the wife who'd run away at the first sign of trouble, while Victoria was the woman he'd loved for years. As she reached the edge of the property, she saw a familiar figure walking toward her. Henderson, carrying a basket of vegetables from the kitchen garden. "Mrs. Ashford." His face lit up with surprise and relief. "I didn't expect to see you here. Henderson, I need your help," Celeste said urgently. "It's about Victoria. She's not what she seems." The butler's expression grew serious. "I had my suspicions, ma'am. She's been asking a lot of questions about the master's business affairs, and I've caught her in his study several times when she claimed to be resting. She's planning to steal from him. She has some kind of legal documents, and there's a man helping her." "Mrs. Ashford?" Another voice interrupted them, and Celeste's heart stopped. Nathaniel was walking toward them across the garden, his expression unreadable. "I thought you'd left on the afternoon train." I missed it," she said weakly. "I see." He stopped a few feet away, and Celeste could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself. "Are you planning to catch the next one?" It was a simple question, but Celeste could hear the weight behind it. This was her chance, maybe her only chance, to tell him the truth about Victoria, about what she'd overheard, about why she'd really left. But looking at his guarded expression, she realized that the truth about Victoria was only part of the problem. The real question was whether Nathaniel wanted her to stay, regardless of what his former fiancé was planning. And for that answer, she'd have to take the biggest risk of all. She'd have to trust that the man who'd taught her to read with her fingers might also be willing to listen with his heart. "That depends," she said quietly, "on whether you want me to." The silence stretched between them while Henderson diplomatically excused himself. In the distance, Celeste could see Victoria watching from an upstairs window, her beautiful face twisted with something that looked very much like rage. Whatever happened next, Celeste realized, the real battle was just beginning. The candlelight flickered against the study walls as Celeste crept through the darkness, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. It was past midnight, and the entire house slept except for her, and possibly Victoria, who might be awake plotting her next move. Celeste had waited 3 hours after everyone retired to begin her desperate search for proof of Victoria's scheme. Nathaniel's desk drawers were locked, but Henderson had quietly slipped her the spare key after their conversation in the garden. The old butler believed her story about Victoria's deception, even if Nathaniel himself seemed torn between trust and doubt. Their earlier conversation had ended with more questions than answers, and Nathaniel had retreated to his room looking troubled and confused. The first drawer contained ordinary business correspondence, letters from banks, mining companies, and railroad investors. But the second drawer held something that made Celeste's heart race. Legal documents partially filled out, with spaces for signatures and dates. The papers looked official and intimidating, full of language about transfer of assets and power of attorney that she didn't fully understand. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Celeste spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. "Looking for something specific?" Victoria's voice was honey-sweet, but her eyes glittered dangerously in the candlelight. She stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe, her golden hair loose around her shoulders, looking like an angel hiding devil's horns. "I couldn't sleep," Celeste said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was looking for something to read." "In Nathaniel's business papers?" Victoria stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. "How curious. Most people look for books in the library." Celeste's hands trembled as she tried to casually close the drawer, but Victoria was already moving closer, her smile sharp as a blade. "You know, don't you?" Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. "You've figured out my little secret. There was no point in pretending anymore. I know you're not here because you love him. I know about the man you were meeting with and the papers, and your plan to steal everything he has." Victoria laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Steal is such an ugly word. I prefer to think of it as collecting what I'm owed. Do you have any idea what I've been through these past 5 years? The humiliation of being known as the woman who abandoned a blind man. The way people whispered behind their hands at parties. So you decided to rob him?" "I decided to take what should have been mine anyway." Victoria's eyes blazed with fury. If he hadn't insisted on that ridiculous horse riding display, if he hadn't been so eager to show off for the wedding guests, none of this would have happened. His accident ruined my life just as much as his. The casual selfishness of it took Celeste's breath away. His accident ruined your life? He's the one who lost his sight. And I lost my future. Do you think I wanted to spend my life married to a blind man? Taking care of someone who couldn't even see my face? Victoria stepped closer, and Celeste could smell her expensive perfume mixed with something else. Something desperate and dangerous. But now I've found a way to make it right. The mining claims alone are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And once I have power of attorney, I can access everything. He'll never sign those papers once he knows the truth. Victoria's smile turned predatory. He'll sign them because he thinks I've come back to marry him. Poor, lonely Nathaniel, so desperate for love that he can't see what's right in front of his face. Literally. And what about his marriage to me? What about it? You already left once. Everyone in town saw you get on that train. It won't be hard to convince people that you've abandoned him for good. Victoria reached into her robe and pulled out a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid. Especially after your tragic accident. Celeste's blood turned to ice. What is that? Something to help you sleep. Permanently. Victoria uncorked the bottle, and a bitter smell filled the air. I really am sorry, dear. You seem like a nice enough girl. But you've become a problem that needs solving. You're insane if you think you can poison me and get away with it. Who's going to suspect me? Poor Celeste, so despondent over her failed marriage that she took her own life. It happens all the time, young wives who can't handle the isolation of frontier life. Victoria lunged forward with the bottle, but Celeste was ready. She grabbed the heavy brass candlestick from the desk and swung it hard, catching Victoria on the wrist. The bottle flew from her hand and shattered against the wall, its contents spreading across the floor like liquid death. Victoria screamed in rage and pain, clutching her injured wrist. You little fool. Do you think this changes anything? I have powerful friends. Men who know how to make problems disappear. Is that who you were meeting with at the old mining office? Your powerful friend. Among others. Victoria's eyes were wild now, her careful mask completely gone. You have no idea what you're dealing with. The mining business in Nevada is controlled by men who don't hesitate to eliminate obstacles. The study door burst open, and Nathaniel appeared with Henderson close behind him. Both men were in their nightclothes, obviously roused by Victoria's scream. What's happening here? Nathaniel demanded, his head turning toward the sound of voices and the smell of spilled poison. Your wife tried to poison me, Victoria cried, immediately switching back to her innocent victim act. I caught her going through your private papers, and when I confronted her, she attacked me. That's not true, Celeste protested. She's the one who. Look at my wrist. Victoria held up her injured arm, tears streaming down her face. She hit me with that candlestick. I was just trying to protect your business interests, and she went mad. Nathaniel's face was a mask of confusion and pain. He couldn't see the broken bottle on the floor or the wild look in Victoria's eyes. All he could hear were two different versions of the truth, and Celeste realized with growing horror that Victoria's lies might sound more believable than her desperate accusations. Sir, Henderson said quietly, I can smell something strange in the air, something chemical. She spilled her laudanum, Victoria said quickly. She must have been taking it for nerves, and when I surprised her, she dropped the bottle. That's not laudanum, Celeste said desperately. Henderson, look at the bottle. Look at how it shattered. She was trying to force me to drink it. But even as she spoke, she could see doubt creeping into Nathaniel's expression. Why would he believe her? The wife who'd already tried to leave him once over Victoria, the woman he'd loved for years. I think everyone should return to their rooms, Nathaniel said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. We can sort this out in the morning when tempers have cooled. Nathaniel, please, Celeste begged. You have to listen to me. She's not who you think she is. She's planning to steal everything from you. Enough. His voice was sharp, cutting through her protests. I said we'll discuss this tomorrow. As Henderson began cleaning up the broken glass, Victoria caught Celeste's eye and smiled. A cold, triumphant expression that promised this was far from over. Walking back to her room, Celeste's mind raced with possibilities. Victoria had powerful friends in the mining business, men who made problems disappear. She tried to poison Celeste tonight, and when that failed, she twisted the story to make herself look like the victim. But the most terrifying realization was that Victoria might be winning. Nathaniel clearly didn't know who to believe, and without proof of Victoria's real intentions, it would be her word against that of the woman he'd once planned to marry. As Celeste lay in her bed, listening to the house settle around her, she wondered if she'd survive long enough to expose Victoria's scheme. Because one thing was crystal clear: Victoria Caldwell would stop at nothing to get what she wanted, even if it meant murder. The question was, what would Celeste be willing to risk to save the man she was beginning to realize she truly loved? The morning sun painted strange shadows across the breakfast table as three people sat in awkward silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Celeste picked at her eggs while watching Victoria butter her toast with delicate precision, acting for all the world like nothing had happened the night before. Nathaniel sat between them, his face unreadable as he drank his coffee. "I've been thinking about our conversation last evening," he said finally, setting down his cup with deliberate care. "About the papers you found in my desk, Celeste." Victoria's hand stilled for just a moment on her toast, but her voice remained perfectly calm. "What papers, darling?" "I thought we agreed that Celeste had simply gotten confused in the dark." "Legal documents," Nathaniel continued, his attention focused on Celeste's side of the table. "Documents that Henderson tells me have been moved several times in recent days." "I can explain that," Victoria said quickly. "I was looking for writing paper yesterday and accidentally disturbed some of your business correspondence. I tried to put everything back exactly as I found it." Celeste watched the smooth lie roll off Victoria's tongue and felt her heart sink. How could she compete with someone who twisted the truth so effortlessly? "Show me these papers," Nathaniel said to Celeste. "I want to understand what you found so disturbing." They moved to the study, where Henderson had discreetly left the legal documents on top of the desk. Nathaniel ran his fingers over the pages, feeling for the raised impressions that would tell him about official seals and signatures. "These are transfer papers," he said slowly, "for the silver mining claims. But they're blank, no signatures, no dates." "That's because they're drafts," Victoria explained smoothly. "I asked my attorney friend to draw them up as examples, in case you ever wanted to reorganize your business holdings. It's quite common for wealthy men to consolidate their assets for tax purposes." "You asked your attorney to draft papers for my business?" Nathaniel's voice carried a note of surprise. "I was trying to be helpful. I know how hard it is for you to manage all the details, and I thought—" Victoria's voice caught, as if she were fighting back tears. "I thought if I could assist with some of the paperwork, it might show you that I'm not the same selfish girl who ran away 5 years ago." Celeste wanted to scream. Every word was calculated to play on Nathaniel's emotions, to make Victoria seem caring and repentant while making Celeste look paranoid and jealous. "What about the man I saw you meeting with?" Celeste pressed. "At the old mining office?" "What man?" Victoria's eyes widened in apparent confusion. "I've been to the old office a few times to look at the historical mining records. I thought they might help with the property search I mentioned. But I've always gone alone. I saw you talking to someone. I heard you planning." "Planning what?" "Celeste, dear, I'm worried about you." Victoria reached over and touched Celeste's hand with false concern. "First you thought I was trying to poison you. Now you're imagining mysterious men and secret conspiracies. Perhaps the stress of this situation has been harder on you than we realized." The way she said it made Celeste sound hysterical, unbalanced. And without witnesses or concrete proof, how could she convince Nathaniel that his beloved Victoria was a calculating criminal? "I found this near the mining office," Celeste said desperately, pulling the torn paper from her reticule. "It mentions power of attorney and asset transfers." Nathaniel felt the paper carefully, then handed it to Victoria. "What do you make of this?" Victoria studied it for a moment, then gave a small laugh. "This is from an old legal journal. Look at the date in the corner. 1859. It must have blown out of some old files. Really, Celeste, this proves nothing except that you've been wandering around the property, going through abandoned buildings and picking up random pieces of paper. Celeste stared at the document Victoria handed back to her. In the top corner, barely visible, was indeed an old date. But she was certain this was the paper the mysterious man had dropped. Wasn't she? Doubt crept into her mind like poison. Had she been so desperate to find evidence against Victoria that she'd imagined connections that didn't exist? The stress of the past few weeks, the confusion of her feelings for Nathaniel, the shock of Victoria's return. Could all of that have made her see threats where none existed? Perhaps, Nathaniel said gently. We should call the doctor. The past few days have been difficult for all of us, and I'm not crazy, Celeste burst out, then immediately regretted it. Protesting too loudly would only make her seem more unbalanced. Of course you're not crazy, Victoria said soothingly. You're just overwhelmed. It's perfectly understandable, you're so young, and this situation is so complicated. Why don't you rest today? I'll take care of everything. The kindness in her voice was masterful, making Celeste's accusations sound even more unreasonable by comparison. And Nathaniel was nodding, clearly relieved to have an explanation that didn't require choosing between two conflicting stories. That might be best, he agreed. Celeste, why don't you spend the day in your room? I'll have Henderson bring you some tea that will help you sleep. I don't need to sleep. But even as she said it, Celeste realized how shrill she sounded. Victoria's trap was perfect. Any protest would only reinforce the image of an unstable woman having a breakdown. Left with no choice, Celeste retreated to her room, her mind racing with frustration and fear. Victoria had outmaneuvered her completely, turning every piece of evidence into proof of Celeste's supposed instability. Worse, she could see that Nathaniel wanted to believe Victoria's version of events. It was easier than accepting that the woman he'd once loved was capable of such deception. From her window, Celeste watched Victoria and Nathaniel walk through the garden together, their heads bent in intimate conversation. Victoria's hand rested on Nathaniel's arm, and even from a distance, Celeste could see how comfortable they looked together, how naturally they moved as a pair. A soft knock interrupted her brooding. Henderson entered with a tea tray, his expression troubled. The master asked me to bring this to you, he said quietly. But I wanted you to know, I believe your story about Miss Caldwell. Then why won't he listen to me? Henderson set down the tray and glanced toward the door, making sure they wouldn't be overheard. Because he doesn't want to believe it, ma'am. The master has been alone for 5 years, convinced that no one could love a blind man. When Miss Caldwell came back with her apologies and explanations, it gave him hope that maybe he'd been wrong. So he'll ignore the truth because he wants to believe her lies? Not ignore exactly, but he needs stronger proof than what we have. Something she can't explain away. Henderson paused, then pulled a folded paper from his pocket. That's why I took the liberty of sending a telegram to the sheriff in Sacramento, where Miss Caldwell claims to have been living. I asked him to verify her story about her activities these past few years. Celeste's heart leaped with hope. And, no reply yet, but I expect to hear something by tomorrow. Henderson moved toward the door, then turned back. Ma'am, be careful. I've been watching Miss Caldwell, and there's something cold behind her smiles. Whatever she's planning, I don't think she's finished yet. As the door closed behind him, Celeste paced her room like a caged animal. Outside, Victoria's musical laughter drifted up from the garden, probably charming Nathaniel with some story about their shared past. Every moment that passed was another moment for Victoria to tighten her web around him. But Henderson's telegram gave her hope. If the sheriff in Sacramento could disprove Victoria's story about where she'd been living, it might be the crack in her facade that would bring the whole deception tumbling down. The question was whether they could get that proof before Victoria convinced Nathaniel to sign whatever papers she was planning, or before she found another way to eliminate the inconvenient wife who stood in her way. As afternoon faded into evening, Celeste made a decision. She couldn't wait passively for Henderson's telegram. If Victoria was planning something, Celeste needed to catch her in the act with evidence even she couldn't explain away. Tonight, she would follow Victoria wherever she went, no matter how dangerous it might be. Because the alternative, watching helplessly as the woman she was learning to love was systematically destroyed by a beautiful liar, was something she simply couldn't accept. The real battle was about to begin, and this time, Celeste intended to be ready for it. The storm hit Carson Valley like God's own fury, turning the night into a chaos of wind and lightning that rattled every window in the great house. Celeste pressed herself against the cold glass of her bedroom window, watching sheets of rain slash across the grounds while thunder shook the walls. Through the wild darkness, she could see a light moving in the old mining office where she'd first discovered Victoria's secret meeting. Someone was out there in this terrible weather, and Celeste was certain it wasn't an innocent late-night stroll. She grabbed her cloak and crept through the hallway, her heart pounding as loudly as the rain on the roof. The house groaned and creaked around her like a living thing in pain. Lightning flashed, illuminating the portraits on the walls in brief, ghostly moments that made her jump. Nathaniel's door was closed, no light showing underneath. Victoria's room was dark too, but when Celeste pressed her ear to the door, she heard nothing, not even breathing. The room was empty. Outside, the storm was even more terrifying than it had looked from her window. Wind howled through the trees like wild animals, and rain hit her face like tiny bullets. She pulled her hood up and fought her way across the grounds, using the lightning flashes to guide her toward the mining office. Mud sucked at her shoes with every step, and branches whipped around her head. Once, a piece of debris flew past so close she felt it brush her hair. This was madness. No sane person would be out in weather like this unless they had no choice. The light in the mining office was steady now, protected from the wind by the building's walls. As Celeste got closer, she could see shadows moving inside, at least 2 people, maybe more. Their voices were lost in the howling wind, but their gestures looked urgent, even angry. She crept around to the same window where she'd hidden before, her whole body shaking from cold and fear. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see Victoria pacing back and forth while a man in a dark coat sat at the desk. But this wasn't the same man from before. This one was younger, with a thin face and nervous eyes. "The storm is perfect cover," Victoria was saying, her voice just loud enough to carry over the wind. "No one will be out tonight to see us." "I still don't like it," the man replied, shuffling through papers on the desk. "Murder is one thing, but this, if we're caught." "We won't be caught if you do your job right." Victoria's voice was sharp with impatience. "The house is isolated. Everyone will be asleep. And in this storm, no one will hear anything until it's too late." Celeste's blood turned to ice. They were planning to kill someone tonight, but who? Nathaniel? Henderson? Her? "The blind man trusts me completely now," Victoria continued. "He'll open his door if I tell him there's an emergency. Once we're inside, it should be simple enough. And the girl, she's been conveniently locked in her room all day, resting from her breakdown. We can handle her at the same time, make it look like a murder-suicide. Poor unstable wife kills her husband, then takes her own life in remorse." The casual way Victoria discussed murder made Celeste feel sick. She had to get back to the house, had to warn Nathaniel. But as she started to move away from the window, her foot slipped in the mud, and she fell hard against the side of the building. The impact was loud enough to be heard even over the storm. Inside, the conversation stopped abruptly. "What was that?" The man's voice was sharp with alarm. "Check outside," Victoria ordered. "If someone's listening." Celeste scrambled to her feet and ran, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, she heard the mining office door slam open and shouts that were quickly swallowed by the wind. She stumbled through the darkness, rain blinding her, branches tearing at her cloak. Lightning flashed, and in that brief moment of light, she saw the man from the office running after her. He was closer than she'd expected, his long legs covering ground fast despite the mud and debris. She changed direction, heading for the thick woods that bordered the property. If she could lose him in the trees, she might have a chance to circle back to the house. But the forest was treacherous in the storm. Roots and fallen branches made every step dangerous, and the darkness between lightning flashes was absolute. A branch caught her cloak and spun her around. She fought free but lost precious seconds, and when the next lightning flash came, she saw her pursuer was only yards behind her. His face was twisted with determination, and something metallic glinted in his hand. Celeste ran harder, crashing through underbrush that scraped her arms and face. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt like they were made of lead. She couldn't keep this up much longer, but she couldn't stop either. If they caught her, Nathaniel would die thinking she'd abandoned him again. The trees opened suddenly into a clearing, and Celeste found herself at the edge of the swollen creek that ran through the property. The water was rushing fast and high, filled with debris from the storm. In normal weather it was barely knee-deep, but now it looked like a river ready to sweep away anything that fell into it. She looked back and saw lights moving through the trees. They'd brought lanterns and were spreading out to surround her. Going back wasn't an option. The creek was her only chance. Celeste took a deep breath and jumped, the icy water hitting her like a physical blow. The current was stronger than she'd expected, and for a terrifying moment, she thought it would drag her under. But she managed to grab onto a fallen log and pull herself toward the opposite bank. Behind her, she heard cursing and shouting, but the men weren't willing to follow her into the dangerous water. She'd bought herself time, but not much. They'd find another way across, and when they did, they'd head straight for the house. Soaked and exhausted, Celeste fought her way through more woods toward home. Every muscle in her body ached, and she was so cold she could barely feel her fingers. But she was alive, and she had information that could save Nathaniel's life. The house appeared through the trees like a beacon, its windows glowing warmly against the storm. Celeste staggered up the front steps and pounded on the door with numb fists. Henderson opened it immediately, his eyes wide with shock at her appearance. "Mrs. Ashford, what in heaven's name? Where's Nathaniel?" she gasped, water streaming from her clothes onto the marble floor. "In his study, but ma'am, you're soaked through. They're coming to kill him." The words tumbled out between chattering teeth. "Victoria and some men. They have a plan. They're going to make it look like I murdered him." Henderson's face went pale. "Sir," he called, running toward the study. "Sir, you need to come quickly." Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, his face creased with concern. "Celeste? What's happened?" "Victoria isn't who you think she is," Celeste said desperately, trying to speak clearly through her shivering. "I followed her to the mining office tonight. She's planning to rob you, and when I overheard her talking about murder, they chased me through the storm." "Murder?" Nathaniel's voice was sharp with disbelief. "They want to kill you tonight and make it look like I did it. Then they'll have access to everything you own." Celeste grabbed his arm, feeling how solid and warm he was, how real. "Please, you have to believe me this time." For a long moment, Nathaniel was silent. Then he turned to Henderson. "Send Carlos to fetch the sheriff immediately, storm or no storm. And wake the other men. Tell them to arm themselves and watch all the entrances." "You believe me?" Celeste whispered. "I believe that someone chased you through a storm dangerous enough to kill you," Nathaniel said grimly. "And I believe that Victoria has been asking too many questions about my business for an innocent woman. I've been a fool, but I'm not blind to everything." A crash of thunder overhead was followed by the sound of breaking glass somewhere in the house. Victoria and her men had arrived, and they weren't bothering with subtlety anymore. The real fight was about to begin, and this time, there would be no pretending, no lies, no second chances. Either Celeste and Nathaniel would survive the night together, or Victoria's deadly plan would succeed. As footsteps echoed in the hallway and voices called out in fake concern, Celeste realized that everything she'd ever wanted, love, safety, a real home, was about to be decided in the next few minutes. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break inside the house. Glass crunched under Victoria's elegant boots as she stepped through the shattered library window, rain streaming from her dark cloak like she was some kind of avenging angel. Her golden hair was plastered to her head, and her beautiful face was twisted with rage that made her look like a completely different person, someone capable of terrible things. "Oh, Nathaniel," she called in a voice that sounded sweetly concerned, though her eyes glittered with malice. "There's been an accident. I saw someone break into the house." Behind her, two men climbed through the broken window, the nervous one from the mining office and another who was built like a prizefighter. Both carried guns that looked well-used and dangerous. Celeste pressed herself against the study wall, her wet clothes making puddles on the floor. Nathaniel stood in front of his desk, his head tilted as he listened to the footsteps moving through his house. Henderson had disappeared to gather the other servants, but Celeste wasn't sure how much help a butler and some gardeners would be against armed men. "She's not in her room," the nervous man reported quietly to Victoria. "Bed's empty, windows open." "Then she's hiding somewhere," Victoria hissed. "Find her." Their voices carried clearly through the house, and Celeste realized they weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. The storm covered most sounds, and they thought they had complete control of the situation. "Nathaniel, darling, where are you?" Victoria called again, her voice moving closer to the study. "I'm so frightened. There are strangers in the house." "Stay behind me," Nathaniel whispered to Celeste, reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a pistol. His hands were steady as he checked that it was loaded, moving with the confidence of someone who'd handled weapons long before he lost his sight. "You know how to use that?" Celeste breathed. "My father taught me to hunt when I was 12. Losing my sight didn't make me forget how to pull a trigger." His voice was grim but determined. "Besides, in the dark, we're on more equal ground than they think." Victoria's footsteps stopped just outside the study door. "Nathaniel? Are you in there? I need you." The door handle turned slowly, and Victoria stepped into the room with tears streaming down her face. Though whether from rain or calculated performance, Celeste couldn't tell. "Oh, thank goodness you're safe." Victoria rushed toward Nathaniel with her arms outstretched. "There are men with guns, and they're looking for Celeste. I think she might have brought them here." It was brilliant and evil at the same time. Victoria was setting up her story even as she moved to attack, making it look like Celeste was the real threat. But Nathaniel didn't lower his gun or move toward Victoria's embrace. Instead, he kept the weapon pointed steadily in her direction. "That's close enough, Victoria." She stopped, her mask of fear slipping for just a moment. "Darling, what are you doing?" "It's me. I know exactly who you are," Nathaniel said quietly. "The question is whether you know that I know." "I don't understand." "The telegram from Sacramento arrived an hour ago." Henderson's voice came from the doorway, where he stood with Carlos and two other men from the estate. All of them were armed with hunting rifles. "Seems Miss Caldwell hasn't been living the quiet life she claimed. Been keeping company with some very unsavory characters involved in mining claim fraud." Victoria's beautiful face went completely blank for a moment, then twisted with fury. "You meddling old fool. The sheriff in Sacramento was quite helpful," Henderson continued calmly. "Especially when I mentioned the name Edmund Pike. That would be your friend from the mining office, the one with the nervous disposition." At the mention of that name, Victoria's composure shattered completely. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Edmund and his associates don't leave loose ends. Like you planned to leave no loose ends here?" Nathaniel's voice was ice-cold. "Murder my wife. Kill me. Steal everything I've worked for? You were supposed to be grateful." Victoria screamed, all pretense gone. "I came back for you. I was willing to overlook your condition, and you chose some nobody farm girl over me. I chose someone who sees me as I am, not as what I can give her." The sound of running footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of Victoria's companions. They burst into the study with guns drawn, but stopped short when they saw the rifles pointed at them from multiple directions. "Seems like your friends are outnumbered," Henderson observed mildly. The nervous man, Edmund Pike, looked around the room with growing panic. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Victoria, you said it would be simple." "Shut up, you fool," Victoria snarled, but the damage was done. Her carefully laid plans were crumbling, and everyone could see the desperation in her eyes. "You know," Nathaniel said conversationally, though his gun never wavered, "I probably would have given you money if you'd just asked. I'm not a cruel man, Victoria, but you wanted it all, didn't you? Not just my wealth, but the satisfaction of destroying me in the process. You destroyed me first." Victoria's voice cracked with genuine emotion for the first time. "Do you know what it was like? Being pitted by everyone. Poor Victoria. Abandoned a blind man at the altar. My reputation was ruined. No decent man would marry me after that. So you decided to become a criminal instead of facing the consequences of your choices? I decided to take what should have been mine." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark black and white. In that moment, Victoria looked like a painting of madness, beautiful and terrible and completely broken. "It's over, Victoria," Celeste said quietly from her position near the wall. "Whatever you thought you'd gain, it's finished now." Victoria's head snapped toward her with such hatred that Celeste took a step back. "This is all your fault. If you hadn't interfered, if you hadn't come back." "I came back because I love him," Celeste said simply. "Not his money, not his house, not what he could give me. Him." For a moment, the room was completely silent except for the storm raging outside. Then Victoria laughed. A broken, bitter sound that made everyone flinch. "Love," she spat. "How wonderfully naive. Let's see how much you love him when you're both dead." She moved faster than anyone expected, lunging not for Nathaniel but for Celeste, a small knife appearing in her hand from somewhere in her cloak. But Victoria had forgotten that Nathaniel's hearing was sharper than any sighted person's, trained by years of navigating the world through sound alone. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Victoria spun around and fell, the knife clattering across the floor as she clutched her shoulder. "The next one won't be a warning shot," Nathaniel said calmly. Henderson and his men quickly disarmed Victoria's companions, who seemed relieved to surrender rather than continue fighting. Outside, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the sheriff, finally able to make the dangerous ride through the storm. As the sheriff and his deputies took Victoria and her men into custody, she looked back at Nathaniel with something that might have been regret. "I really did love you once," she said quietly. "Before the accident, before everything went wrong. I loved the man you used to be." "I'm the same man I always was," Nathaniel replied. "You just never bothered to look beneath the surface to see who that was." As Victoria was led away into the storm, her golden hair dark with rain and her beautiful face marked by defeat, Celeste realized that the woman had been her own worst enemy. She'd had everything she could have wanted: wealth, beauty, the love of a good man, and she'd thrown it all away for the illusion of control and revenge. The real tragedy wasn't that Victoria had lost Nathaniel, but that she'd never understood what she was losing in the first place. Now, as the storm finally began to weaken and the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Celeste and Nathaniel stood together in the damaged study, surrounded by the debris of the night's violence, but somehow still standing. The question now was what they would build from the ruins of everything they'd thought they knew about love, trust, and the courage it took to choose each other despite all the forces trying to tear them apart.